in John's confession, he put some sort of necklace in the area saying that my brother had Kimberly Ernest necklace. So my mom went out and had a necklace made, a fake Kimberly Ernest
Whoa,
necklace.
that is next level crazy and
She's
vindictive.
vindictive, crazy. I mean, she's his mother.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thanks for joining me for the podcast where personal stories can have a global impact. As you heard in the intro, my guest is the Hall Closet podcast host, Donna Hall. Hello, Donna, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so happy to be a part of your show, Melvin.
I'm excited about hearing your story. I almost couldn't wait.
Yeah, I hear that a lot.
So I usually don't have true crime episodes, but most true crime families don't have stories like yours. Your
That's true.
story isn't just about crime, it's about survival, finding safety, and reclaiming power. So, in the Hall Closet, you dive into your twisted and chaotic upbringing as part of a lower tier crime family outside of Philadelphia in the 80s and 90s. They weren't well known, but you made plenty of headlines in the Philly area. And I first want to start establishing the story, the narrative around your mom. So, we're going to talk about your family life before we're going to talk about your mom before we talk about your stepdad.
Okay.
So your mom spent time in prison for child endangerment. What did she do?
Correct.
What'd she do?
So she left my 12-year-old, so I grew up with, there were 5 children in the family. So my youngest sister was last to be home. I have been on my own since I was 15. She's 6 years younger than I am. So she was home with my mom, sadly, by herself for the last however many years. And my mom decided to choose a man over her and left her home alone for a significant amount of time in the middle of winter without heat, I might add.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's nuts.
Yeah.
So did she go to prison because of that particular case, or was it just an accumulation of things?
No, that was the particular case. Now, child services had been called throughout my entire childhood, but they never took us from the home. It wasn't until my brother found my sister home alone and went to the police.
Wow. So your podcast is called the Hall Closet, as I mentioned. Was that your safe place in your house?
Well, it wasn't necessarily my safe place, but I came up with the name because if you listen to the first episode of my podcast, it'll explain about a pretty traumatic situation that had happened to me. And I did find safety within that closet, that particular moment. So I thought that it was a fitting name given my last name and then that story, which you'll be able to hear in the first episode.
And I have listened to that episode. It was very
Okay.
good. Very, very good. That's why we're here
Thank
today.
you. Thank you.
So what was a typical day like in your home?
A lot of chaos. So the siblings range in age. Like my oldest sister is 11 years older than I am. Then I have a sister who's 9 years older than I am. So those, they were out working or in college by the time I can really have any real memories. So there was a lot of chaos. My mom was dating or having affairs. So she was constantly after work going and meeting men. I and my siblings took care of the housework and taking care of my younger sister. It wasn't really a family. It was just survival at its finest.
What caused you to leave when you were 15?
I'm going to fast forward to in my 40s. I found out in my 40s that my mom got an artificial insemination, believe it or not. Despite all the men that she was sleeping with, she went and got an artificial insemination. So my father is this amazing doctor, and I found out that I'm 50% Ashkenazi Jew. And now that I haven't met him, but now that I know who he is, I truly feel like because I have those genes, I'm like, I had this feeling my whole childhood that this wasn't right. I couldn't be here. I didn't want to be here. And I basically faked a drug addiction to get out. So I told my mom that, I just needed to get out. And I told my mom I'm having difficulty with drinking and cocaine. And she was like, no, you're not. And, cursed at me and told me to get away from her. So I went to school and told the counselor that I had a problem, and they made her take me out of the home and put me into rehab.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I wasn't addicted to cocaine, I might add. I
Yeah.
didn't have a problem with alcohol, but it was like this weird way of me getting out of the situation that I was in.
That must have been pretty desperate for you to come up with that kind of a story to get out of it.
Yeah, well, I grew up with no safety whatsoever. I mean, there was not any time that my nervous system was ever cared for.
Wow. All right, so let's move on to your stepdad, who is sort of
Yeah.
the center of this story. So I guess snitches get stitches didn't scare your stepdad, John Hall. How did he become Philadelphia Police Department's favorite snitch?
So, John was a very intelligent man who did have a drug addiction. If you met him, he was brilliant. And he had this very manipulative way of communicating and making people believe that he was something that he wasn't. So, because he never worked, he spent his whole life stealing, doing drugs, just making it by. Like he would literally walk into car dealerships, walk behind the counter, grab a set of keys, and drive away with the car. I mean, he was a master. He was a master criminal. And what would happen is he would get wasted or get caught stealing a car, and he'd go to jail. And because he was so intelligent and he was able to really be so persuasive, he would kind of sometimes talk his way out of it. But then eventually, when he wasn't able to talk his way out of it, he made deals with the dirty cops and the dirty DA in Philadelphia. So what he would do is he would work with the DA to find a case that they had no information on, that they were struggling to convict, and they would put him in a cell or a cell nearby, and he would go in and literally create his own confession. Like none of the information came from the cellmates. I don't want to say the guilty people because quite a few of them weren't guilty. Now I'm saying some of them may have been, but I know for a fact that some of these cases were innocent men that he was, integral in putting behind bars for a very long time. So
Wow.
he would literally create his own confession. And they weren't like small little confessions, they were long, very, very descriptive, like theatrical pieces that were written, basically. And sadly, my mom was part of this whole ring because she was on the outside going to these people's homes, these victims' homes, sometimes even posing as a reporter to get into the home to see what is the color of the curtains, what's the carpet color, what does the inside of the house look like, so she could come back and report details to him to put into the confession.
Wow. It sounds like they were pretty creative. Why didn't they use that kind of a talent for good? They could have
We
written books and movies and TV shows.
I say it all the time. I mean, aside from that, I mean, he could have probably been a lawyer. He was brilliant. And if you heard him speak, I mean, I have a lot of the letters I have quite a few of the letters that he wrote to my mom and some of the confessions. He was very, very, very smart. He just, was a drug addict. He got addicted to drugs, and, it tears people apart.
So he was known as the Monsignor because he'd heard more confessions than a priest. Was he proud? Was he proud of that nickname?
Well, of course he was. Of course. He was very, he got when every single time that he would go to jail, they treated him like royalty because they knew, and when I say they, I mean the prison guards, the police, the DA, they treated him, like he was somebody, and he knew that he was somebody. He knew that in Philadelphia, if he got pulled over, he had a plethora of people to kind of get him out of the whatever crime he was committing.
Wow. So that's where he probably felt the safest, I'm guessing.
I would say he probably felt the most protected, but who wants to be in jail when he wanted to be out using, sadly.
So,
Sadly.
how many people do you think falsely went to prison because of the Monsignor?
I would say about 20 to 25 people. 20 to 25 people. And I think so. What's also interesting about this whole thing is I fast forwarded to in my 40s when I found out I was artificially inseminated, right? I found out that I was a product of a sperm donation. And in doing so, when I did this ancestry test, which is how it started, I met two siblings, one of which is this. I mean, I have quite a few now. I think I'm up to 10 sisters and 6 brothers, which is really cool. And ironically enough, I am a lot more like my siblings, my dibblings, as I call them, the donor siblings. I'm a lot more like the dibblings than I am the kids that I grew up with. You know, if you were to put me in a room and say, like, whose family does she belong to? I would look and act a lot more like the siblings that I never grew up with, which is kind of really cool about like nature and nurture.
Mm-hmm.
How cool it is that we have like similar laughs. We stand a certain way. We have a lot of similar likes. In fact, we were just talking before we started, Melvin, I'm outing you here. We were talking about menopause. And my siblings on my father's side, my donor siblings, all are suffering with the same intense menopausal symptoms that I am, where my siblings on my mom's side are not, So it's just really interesting how, nature versus nurture and nature really takes over in a lot of ways. So moving forward, I met these two siblings, one of which was this amazing radiologist in California. The other one is, one of my favorite people in the world. She lives in Utah. And when we first started talking, it was like a shock to me that I had these siblings and, they were aware about the donation. So then, of course, I asked my mom and she confirmed it. But as I told my sister from California my mother's name, she replied back to me and said, Phyllis Hall. This is interesting. Does she happen to be married to Philadelphia's jailhouse snitch, John Hall? And I was blown away. And I was like, yes. Now, this is a sibling I've never met. This is a woman who lives a complete different life than I live, a beautiful, life in California with an amazing career, completely different than me. And I said, yeah, how do you know that? And she tells me, I just read this book called The Trials of Walter Ogrot. I don't know, Melvin, if you've heard of the book, but it's the shocking murder, so-called confessions, and notorious snitch that sent a man to death row by Tom
Yes,
Lowenstein. Okay.
I've heard of it, and I've got a couple questions leading up to that.
Okay. So what's interesting is I didn't know any of this until I didn't know that there was a book written. I didn't know my mom was a part of this. I didn't know that my stepfather was a jailhouse snitch until I was in my 40s and my dibling tells me about this book that is written. And I was like, I was just blown away. Like, how did you hear about this book? So she tells me she listened to the podcast Serial and it was a recommended reading afterwards. So, and I had listened to the same podcast, but never heard of the book. So I just think it's so interesting the way that my world kind of always, comes up. I just seem to come into these crazy situations.
It's go ahead.
So the fact that my sister, who I never met and only knew for a week, told me about a book written about my family. Of course, I bought the book immediately, an audiobook, and of course, the paper version or the hardback version. And I read it and was devastated. I was devastated to learn that my mom was such a horrible human being. I knew she was a bad person, but I didn't realize how bad, if that makes sense, specifically pertaining to my brother. And we can get into that, but John and my mom basically told the police, set my brother up for a crime that he didn't commit. A pretty gruesome, very high profile murder in Center City,
Okay,
Philadelphia.
let's go ahead and go into that. I hadn't planned to, but let's keep it moving in that direction.
Yeah, so there was this law student. She was out of Chicago. Her name was Kimberly Ernest. She was brutally murdered during her morning run in the it was like a 5 or 6 a.m. I guess she jogged every morning through the city. And it's a very upscale area of the city. So it's not high crime. I know a lot of people think of Philadelphia and high crime. This was like an upper scale area that she was jogging through, and she was found raped and murdered in like a stairwell of a local business. And it was gruesome and scary and kind of took Philadelphia by surprise. Not that there weren't a lot of other murders. I think it was just how gruesome it was and the area in which it was. So it was kind of plastered all over the news. There was a lot of media involvement across the country. And so John, to get back at my brother for sending my mom to jail for leaving my sister home alone, John set my brother up and told the police that it was him. And because my brother was like a petty criminal in and out of jail for, petty crimes as a teenager and moving forward, he wasn't, he would fully admit that he, struggled with doing the right thing. And again, it was in and out of jail. Sadly, they arrested him and tried him for that murder, which he was eventually acquitted.
Wow. You had terrible parents. I
Yeah,
know you know that, but
I do.
I just want to
And
confirm that.
yeah, and to find out that my mom not only was integral in telling the police that he had told her this, but also my mom had a necklace made. In John's confession, he put some sort of necklace in the area saying that my brother had Kimberly Ernest's necklace. So my mom went out and had a necklace made, a fake Kimberly Ernest
Whoa,
necklace.
that is next level crazy and
She's
vindictive.
vindictive, crazy. I mean, she's his mother. And he didn't have a father because his father died very young. So it's just so sad that she would do that to her son, her only son, to any of her children, let alone her son. It's devastating. It's shocking to me that he can even have a relationship with her today, which he does.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right, there's so many tentacles to this. I don't even know where to go next.
Everyone
But
says that. I'm sorry that I keep pulling it all in. And in my
that
head, it's all straight, but
that's okay. All right, let's just go straight forward because I'm sure we can go in all different directions.
yeah,
So
we
let's
could.
go back to John Hall. So in December 1994, Hall was in the city's detention center facing 25 to 50 years for charges related to a high-speed car chase and assaulting an officer. In the detention center, that's where he met Walter Ogrod, who was
Yes.
awaiting trial for the 1988 sexual assault and murder of 4-year-old Barbara Jean Horn. And then in fall of 2003, he wrote a series of private letters, which you referenced, that were never intended for publication, explaining how he fraudulently helped send Walter Ogrod to death row. Was that because of pressure or his conscience getting to him that he confessed in the letters?
Walter or John? Oh, John?
John, yeah.
John did not confess in the letters. He was writing letters back and forth to my mom. So these letters that you're hearing about that weren't intended for public were to my mother. And the two of them were in, I want to say cahoots. I don't know if that's the right. I mean, the two of them were in cahoots. And she was helping him pin these murders and, excuse me, crimes on all of these victims.
Wow. So you read those letters yourself?
Yes, I have them. Not all of them. There's so many. There's so many and they're so long. But yeah, I have them.
So describe one or two of the letters to me. What was it like seeing it in his own handwriting?
So the letters to me are very bipolar in a way. They start off very manipulative to my, I mean, there's so many different letters, but we'll say in one where he just love bombs my mom, like how amazing she is, how, beautiful she is. They become, some of them are sexual in nature. They have nicknames for each other. And he just talks about how he feels in his mind that he is some sort of superhero to some degree because he's putting these horrible people behind bars. He's giving them what they deserve. So a lot of the crimes were, rape, murder of, a lot of them were murder, but they were rape and they were involving children or women. So in his mind, he felt like he was like serving justice. He literally believed that he was serving justice. Even though he was lying and doing this just to get out of jail, he believed that Walter Ogrod really did this, but he had no proof. And, and same thing with Dean Dixon and all of these other people. He, I guess, rationalized it to some degree. But that's what the letters were, very, very, I would say, self serving, very intelligent. It almost sounds like you're reading a letter from an attorney. Very big words, used appropriately. I wish I had one in front of me. I know that there's one in the book. I wish I could read you some of what the letter was. I wish I knew this. I would have had one. So here it says, you could actually see this, a picture of it in the book. See that?
Okay.
That's his
Yes.
actual writing. So if you do end up getting the book, you'll be able to see that. But he basically, this looks like it was the confession of Walter Ogrod and not a letter to my mom, where it says that John Fahey across the street lived the mother, different drugs, about 37 years old, sometimes assaults the mother. Brother is Henry Fahey, who killed Nikki. And, just all kinds of information in here. He just knows a lot of information. One of the things that the DA would do John always got a job in the law library. So the DA would come in with the file of whatever case he wants help with and give it to John. John could read through all of the information, anything that the detectives had up to that point. So then he would have that as a basis for his confessions.
Wow. And he worked in the law library, so he had access to all the laws.
Yep.
So he knew the statutes. I worked in the law library this summer, and I was between my freshman and sophomore years in college, and it was often very boring. So I would just sit there and read the law books and
Wow.
impress my friends with all this trivial information that I had learned because I was bored and just reading. I'm sure it wasn't trivial to him. That was a part of his plan.
It was a part of his plan. And the other upset of working there is that people who are accused of crimes that they didn't commit and are sent to jail are going to do everything in their power to learn how to protect themselves. They're going to go to the library and they're going to read and they're going to try to find things. So he had access to all these people coming in, talking to him, telling him things about, what they're accused of, or, basically he was getting information from people, but he had like the upper hand because he was getting it first knowledge. And, and I assume he could have even gone to the DA and said, hey, I just heard from this guy. What do you think? What kind of information do you have? Do you have enough to put him away? So, yeah, it's insane.
So was he ever worried about fellow inmates finding out he was the snitch?
I don't think he was ever, I mean, I don't know because I'm not him, but I would say that he was very, very well protected. They didn't have him in general population. They had him on different units that were more protected. Okay. And he had his own, oftentimes he had his own cell. He had a TV in his cell. They gave him a lot of amenities that a lot of the other prisoners didn't have.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that probably also helped him create the images that he created because he had access to TV and the news.
Yes. Not only that, but it gave him this very big sense of character. Like he's self-absorbed, like I'm this person, with his shoulders up and kind of walking around with that like feeling and kind of portraying that out within the population, within the jail. And, other inmates looked at him as either a doctor or a lawyer. I know they thought that he was a doctor at some point. In fact, the way that my mom met, do you know this? Do you know how they met?
I know a little bit. I know he faked being a doctor and wrote prescriptions and stuff like that.
Yeah. So the way that my mom met him, my brother was in jail and he had met John and had thought that he was a doctor, thought that he was in there for writing bad scripts or something, which was happening a lot at the time because it was right in the beginning of when, like people were, I guess they were starting to see that doctors were, writing prescriptions for people for drug use as opposed to for pain. So it wasn't unheard of that this had happened. But my brother introduced my mom to someone that he met in prison, and they started talking on the phone while John was in jail. My brother would call home every night or every couple of nights, and he was like, hey, Mom, there's this guy in here, John. His last name is Hall, which our last name was Hall as already. My mom had married a Frank Hall. Yeah.
This is a soap opera.
It's a Netflix series. Come on, or a Hulu series.
Okay, yeah, okay, but much better than a soap opera. All right, so your brother introduced John to your mom, and then John and your mom put your brother
Hmm.
behind bars.
Yeah. So he came out of jail and moved in with us. John. John got out of jail, never met him before, and all of a sudden he's my stepdaddy.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, wow, wow. Okay, so what kind of criminal justice reforms were passed as a direct result of things that John Hall had done?
I don't know if there's any necessarily things that have been passed, but I know that since my brother's interrogation, because there's, this guy named Marty Devlin, who was the detective in the case with Walter Ograd. He actually and I really need to find out. He was just on trial for perjury for false confessions. Just last week it ended, but I was not able to find out what happened, if he was convicted or if he was acquitted. So hopefully I'll get back to you on that. But my brother was beat pretty badly during his confession by Marty Devlin and the team there. So what has happened since that is that they now record all confessions, because it came out what happened to my brother and the beating, and the only reason it happened was because he was transferred from Bucks, which is Bucks County. He was transferred from Bucks County Prison and taken to Philly. And in Bucks, what they did was they were realizing that anyone who went to Philly was coming back abused, beaten, whatever. So they took a picture of him before he left. And then when, I guess, my brother must have known that or something. I don't know how that all went down. But once he was eventually acquitted, then he was able to say, hey, I left Bucks. They took a picture of me. Here's what I looked like in my mugshot after you guys beat me. So there was that reform. So thankfully in Philly, they now video all of those types of, when they, bring you in for questioning.
Okay. So the end of John Hall's life, do you think it was ironic that the only opponent he couldn't beat turned out to be your mom?
So do I think it's ironic? I feel like this is my mom. It's somewhat scary to me because I'm sharing a lot of information about her and I know she's not happy with me. So there's a little piece of me that's kind of like, what could she do to me? But my mom always gets the last word. She always screws the one that screwed her every single time. Every single time. So I think that he met his match with her, and I think that he taught her a lot about, criminality and what you can get away with and what you can't. And yeah, she really got him.
So how did he die?
He died of a drug overdose and or a hot shot. He was either murdered with a hot shot or he overdosed. There's a lot of speculation about someone, having killed him because he had a lot of enemies. A lot of people didn't like him.
And he was, from what I've heard, he was homeless at the time he died, and his body was discovered
Yes.
out in the woods. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, it was discovered on a park bench in Allentown, PA, which is Lehigh County, which was near where my mom lived. So I'm not sure why he was up there. Maybe to see my mom.
So what was their relationship like at the end, towards the end?
So I had obviously not been a part. I left that life and tried to forget it, honestly. But I think at the end, she still most likely loved him. I think they had this really strong trauma bond. I think they both met their match, but I imagine that she just knew that they couldn't be together.
And you mentioned your mom is still alive, and it makes you have a little bit of a twinge of fear when you tell this story.
Yeah,
Would you be able to tell the story at all if John Hall was still alive?
probably not. I don't think I would. I don't think I would. I would be very, very fearful. I'm already fearful with my brother and my mom. So, but John is a whole nother level. So that's a good question and one that no one's asked me yet. That's a very good question.
I love it when people say that. A question that nobody else is asking. So how long did it take before you were able to tell your own story? Of course, you didn't even know a lot of your story until you were in your 40s.
Yeah. So even up until my 40s, I always felt like I had wanted to write a book. I had started writing a book, people, anyone, any therapist that I've ever been to, anyone I've ever spoken to about what it was like growing up was always so fascinated by how unbelievable the stories really are. So I knew and I know that I have a lot to offer and I have a lot that I could share. I think I just struggled often and truthfully, I struggled with not feeling good enough. I grew up not being loved. So I felt like I wasn't smart enough. I wasn't good enough. I could never do that. I could never be successful at anything. So it kind of really hindered me. And it wasn't until my one of my older sisters and I came up with a name for a book and we started writing things and we tried to meet with different authors to help us write and we just weren't able to put it together. And then one of my siblings actually said to me, "Hey, I think your story's incredible. You have a great voice. You're an amazing storyteller. I think you should get into podcasting." And I was like, "Okay." I literally bought a computer, a mic the next day, and I started, but it was so hard to really pull together, me as my own person, never doing it and not having the knowledge. I would record and record, and I had all these episodes recorded, but it didn't feel right to me. So it wasn't until um, I met Alan Katz on his podcast because he had asked me to be on his podcast as like what it felt like to be a donor conceived child. So after meeting him and talking to him, we were like, we need to do this together. And sure enough, he's amazing. And he was really able to help me tell my story, pull out the important pieces and kind of connect everything together.
Yeah, I know about your story because of Alan. He was on my podcast 2 weeks ago and he mentioned it in sort of in passing. And I said, wait a minute. That's not just a story you hit and run. You got to tell me some more details. And he helped connect us. And that's how we're here today.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny. And I imagine, so when Alan first heard my story, he comes from a very, I would say, kind of grew up in a bubble. He comes from a very sheltered upper scale life where he didn't really see any of this type of, nothing even close to what I experienced. So I think it was such a shock to him. But now that, just like anything, now that he's told my story and he's heard me, we've literally spent hours upon hours where I'm bawling my eyes out and sharing very, very intimate things. It kind of becomes, oh, that's Donna. That's her story. It's not quite as shocking when you know it and then learn it. And then you realize that, I'm just a normal person. Anyone who would ever meet me would never know what I've experienced. I hide it well. Yeah. I would say control has always been, I always try to control what I can. And, I know that that's not always the best thing to need control. It's definitely one of my best but worst traits.
So, how different is your life now than it was when you were growing up?
So I would say I have people in my life who love me and who really love me. So it feels so good to have connections with people who want the best for me. And I try to keep my circle tight and, you know, surround myself with people who want to make me better as opposed to pull me down. But I still do have a lot of issues. I have a lot of trust issues. I have a lot of abandonment issues that I'm still at 49 years old working through. I tolerate things from friends and people that I shouldn't because it's familiar, but I recognize it. I have two amazing, I couldn't be more proud of my two children. I have a 25-year-old son who went to college. He's brilliant, works in cybersecurity. And I have a daughter who's graduating from Penn State and just got accepted into grad school. So for AI, artificial intelligence.
Congratulations.
Yeah, so I have two beautiful children, and the one thing that is different about me now than as a child is I give them unconditional love. Now, they may not always agree with me, and I certainly don't always agree with them, but I love them, and there's nothing I would never do the things that my mother did to me to them. Yeah,
So, you work as a bartender now, and bartenders tend to hear some pretty crazy stories.
yeah.
Have you ever heard a story that would top your own story?
No, no, I haven't. I haven't. Now, I will say this. I don't feel like I've had the worst life ever. I always like to say that. I don't, I'm not on here like, oh, poor me, I had this horrible life. That's not, there are many, many people out there who've suffered way more traumatic things. But I think as far as like the longevity of how the story keeps continually evolving and more things keep coming up. I mean, even as late as last week, with the trial of the detective, also Dean Dixon, who is, trying to get out of jail. I think the story just keeps going. The craziness just keeps going. So, while I didn't have my abuse, I just like to always put that disclaimer out there. Like, I'm not saying that I had the worst life ever, because I didn't, you know.
So if you heard a story of somebody in your bar and they were just really focused on how much they suffered or how weird their story was, you always got a trump card. You can just say, "You haven't heard anything yet. Wait till I tell you what I got."
You know what? It's funny. For a long time, I feel like I did that. And then I stopped. Like, I just let people say what they need to say. A lot of times I'm like, oh God, don't even, let's not even get into it, because let's talk about family drama. Now I just give them my, podcast and say, hey, you want to hear a good story?
Perfect. Perfect cross marketing.
And I've had a lot of people. I mean, the podcast I feel like has been successful, considering we have done no advertising. I feel like we've had quite a bit of listens, and people are very still messaging me like how it's helped them. And I think that for me, podcasting is less about sharing my story and more about making the world a better place and letting those who suffer trauma and who've gone through things similar to mine, or not even similar to mine, that there's truth, there's freedom in truth, and speaking your truth and sharing and not keeping these things locked up in your mind. And the number of women and men who've reached out to me in the past couple of months has been astounding. And it feels really good to be able to be a positive light in the world to other people who've also suffered.
And I'm sure it's freeing to be able to tell your story.
Yeah. I mean, I thought that I would. So when I first decided that I was going to do this, and once I listened to the, first couple of episodes, once we got them going, I was like, I'm not sharing this with anyone that I know. I'm not posting it on my social media. No one's going to know, because it's very vulnerable. I'm sharing things that, I've only shared with my therapist. So, and then of course the retaliation piece, and I also worry, do people judge me? Like, are people going to think that I'm not a good human being, that I might hurt them, or I might, rob them or something, because that's the family that I grew up in. That's not at all me. So I did worry about that. But the exact opposite happened. And it actually gave me more, I would say, courage and pride. And you know what? I'm going to be proud of what I've been through. And I'm going to be proud of what I'm doing here, because it's not for any other reason than to make the world a better place. So if you're going to judge me, then that is on you. But most people who listen are not going to be judging. I think the opposite. I think when they realize all I've been through and how I've survived and how they never would have known, I feel like the reaction has been the complete opposite. Like, wow.
Wow. And that's a great way to end this episode. That's a great way to wind it up. You've got love in your life now with
Yeah.
your children. You seem to be fairly happy. You're doing
Yeah.
well. You're making the pieces fit together so that you can understand it. It's a tremendous story. Our
Yeah.
guest today has been Donna Hall. Thank you so much, Donna, for being here. I really appreciate you.
Thank you so much. This has been a great, great, great conversation. I appreciate all of your questions, and how not only that, but how you knew, like, you actually did your research, which is great. So it's very, very refreshing to hop on an interview with someone who actually did research. So thank you.
Appreciate it, because that's one of the most fun parts to me, doing the background research. I love doing that. When somebody says, like you did, that's a question nobody's ever asked me before, I just
Yeah.
glow because I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And it shows good podcasting. It shows that you care about who you're bringing on, and, you want to share their story authentically, as opposed to, like, I've been on many interviews where people are like, wait, what? And it's like they don't even know who I am. So I really, really appreciate that. So thank you so much. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share and, tell you about my podcast. And of course, hopefully we can do some things in the future.
That sounds awesome. Thanks again, Donna. So
Thank
please
you.
go to my website at podcastreallife.com for more information about my guests and the things we discussed today, including a link to Donna's podcast. That's it for today's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another chance to learn from each other. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
It's making me cry.